The 33rd presidential election was held on November 7th, 1916. This election consisted of 6 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Socialist, Prohibition, Progressive, and Socialist Labor parties. The Democratic Party chose Woodrow Wilson as their presidential candidate and Vice President Thomas R. Marshall as their vice presidential candidate. The Republican Party chose Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court Charles Evans Hughes as their presidential nominee and former Vice President Charles W. Fairbanks as their vice presidential nominee. Wilson campaigned on his ability to keep the United States out of World War I. Hughes campaigned on building up the military just in case the United States would get involved in the war. He criticized Wilson for support for revolutionaries in Mexico. Hughes stated that he did not like limiting work hours to 8 hours per day. It was discovered that Wilson actually had a very smart plan for if he lost. Wilson believed that the United States was very close to entering World War I and did not want to risk having a regime change during the war. If Hughes won, Wilson would appoint him to Secretary of State, and then he and his vice president would resign, making Hughes acting president. This would make it so Hughes would be able to become president before joining the war. But Wilson did not have to enact his plan because he ended up winning the election. He won 49.24% of the popular vote and 52.17% of the electoral vote. The only polarizing factor to this election was deciding how involved the United States should be in the World War. The 34th presidential election was held on November 2nd, 1920. This election consisted of 8 political parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Socialist, Farmer Labor, Prohibition, American, Socialist Labor, and Single Tax parties. The Republican Party chose Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding as their presidential nominee, and Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge as their vice presidential nominee. The Democratic Party chose Ohio Governor James M. Cox as their presidential nominee, and Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin D. Roosevelt as their vice presidential nominee. Although the Allies won in World War I, the American people did not want to be involved with war. The people were also unsatisfied with the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson promised to help convince Britain to let Ireland gain independence, but after he won the election, he called Britain a war ally and did not help Ireland. This caused Irish voters in the United States to defect from the Democratic Party. Democrats wanted to join the League of Nations, while Republicans did not. Cox went around the country to campaign while Harding spoke from his front porch. Harding created an American First movement, where he believed the government should see domestic issues as a higher priority than foreign issues. This election was the first where people could hear live results over the radio. With the passage of the 19th Amendment, women were now able to vote in every state. This was the first election where a Republican won a former Confederate state. Warren G. Harding ended up winning the election. He won 60.3% of the popular vote and 76.08% of the electoral vote. This was the best popular vote performance since 1820 and since 1812 for the electoral vote. This election wasn't very polarizing due to a supermajority of Americans using this election as a referendum against wartime involvement. The 35th presidential election was held on November 4th, 1924. This election consisted of 9 parties and 1 coalition party. These parties consisted of the Republican, Democratic, Progressive, Socialist, Farmer Labor, Prohibition, Communist, Socialist Labor, and American parties. The coalition party was the Progressive, Socialist, Farmer Labor Party. After Warren G. Harding's death in 1923, the Republican Party was faced with the task of choosing a new candidate. The Republican Party chose acting President Calvin Coolidge as their presidential nominee, and former director of the Bureau of Budget Charles G. Dawes as their vice presidential nominee. The Democratic Party chose former ambassador to the United Kingdom John W. Davis as their presidential nominee, and Nebraska Governor Charles W. Bryan as their vice presidential nominee. The coalition party chose Wisconsin Senator Robert M. LaFollette as their presidential nominee, and Montana Senator Burton K. Wheeler as their presidential nominee. As there was no war and a booming economy, Coolidge was very liked amongst voters. The Coalition Party, which was called the Progressive Party, did not like the conservatism of both the Republican and Democratic parties. The Progressives wanted there to be more progressivism. Both Republicans and Democrats campaigned for a smaller federal government and the reduction of taxes. On the other hand, Follett wanted the government to raise taxes on the wealthy while spending more money. In the end, Calvin Coolidge won the election. He won 54.04% of the popular vote and 71.94% of the electoral vote. I would say this election wasn't very polarizing due to both Republicans and Democrats agreeing on a lot of policy. While the Progressive Party was seen as the opposition of both parties, it wasn't big enough, in my opinion, to cause much polarization. The 36th presidential election was held on November 6, 1928. This election consisted of 7 parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Socialist, Communist, Socialist Labor, Prohibition, and Farmer Labor Party. As Coolidge refused to run for a second term, the Republican Party chose U.S. Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover as their presidential nominee, and Kansas Senator Charles Curtis as their vice presidential nominee. The Democratic Party chose New York Governor Al Smith as their presidential nominee, and Arkansas Governor Joseph T. Robinson as their vice presidential nominee. As Smith was Catholic, many Americans feared that he would be heavily influenced by the Pope. Many could not vote due to segregation laws. It was believed that Hoover was a supporter of desegregation. Herbert Hoover ended up winning the election. He won 58.21% of the popular vote and 83.62% of the electoral vote. This was the best electoral vote performance since 1864. I would say this election was not very polarizing due to the biggest concern that one candidate was Catholic. The 37th presidential election was held on November 8, 1932. This election consisted of 8 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Socialist, Communist, Prohibition, Liberty, Socialist Labor, and Farmer Labor parties. The Democratic Party chose New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt as their presidential nominee, and Speaker of the House John Nance Garner as their vice presidential nominee. The Republican Party chose President Herbert Hoover as their presidential nominee, and Vice President Charles Curtis as their vice presidential nominee. As the Great Depression had been underway, Roosevelt became a very popular figure. He was seen as the next reform president. In his victory speech for the Democratic nomination, he said, quote, "Ours must be a party of liberal thought, of planned action, of the enlightened internal outlook, and of the greatest good to the greatest number of our citizens." His campaign song, called "Happy Days Are Here," even became popular. Both candidates spend less money on their campaigns, but 20% of their campaign expenses went to radio ads. Many progressive Republicans switched to the Democratic Party during this election. Roosevelt was also Protestant, which prevented him from getting backlash from anti-Catholics. The Great Depression was the biggest concern and made Hoover very unpopular. Prohibition was also very unpopular. While Republicans wanted to keep alcohol illegal, Democrats thought it was best to legalize it and thought the government needed the tax revenue off of alcohol to fight the Depression. Hoover was even unpopular among his own party, with popular Republicans in Congress endorsing Roosevelt. Roosevelt was popular due to his social programs, which he implemented as governor in New York. Franklin D. Roosevelt ended up winning the election. He won 57.41% of the popular vote and 88.89% of the electoral vote. This was the best electoral vote performance since 1864. This election was polarizing due to the Great Depression, Prohibition, and the introduction of social programs that would have expanded the size of the government to its biggest yet. The 38th presidential election was held on November 3rd, 1936. This election consisted of 7 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Union, Socialist, Communist, Prohibition, and Socialist Labor parties. This was the first election where people could vote during the primaries. This was only for the Democratic Party, though. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his running mate, Vice President John Nance Garner, were elected as the Democratic nominees. The Republican Party chose Kansas Governor Alf Landon as their presidential nominee and publisher of the Chicago Daily News, Frank Knox, as their vice presidential nominee. Landon did not campaign much, and of the policies he talked on, they were created by other Republicans. His biggest criticism was his stance against Social Security. He stated that the New Deal wasted too much money. He also said that Roosevelt was corrupt. In the end, Roosevelt won re-election. He won 60.8% of the popular vote and 98.49% of the electoral vote. This was the best popular and electoral vote performance since 1820. This election wasn't very polarizing due to a supermajority of Americans voting for one side. The 39th presidential election was held on November 5th, 1940. This election consisted of 6 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Socialist, Prohibition, Communist, and Socialist Labor parties. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Secretary of Agriculture Henry A. Wallace won the Democratic primary election. The Republican Party chose President of Commonwealth and Southern Wendell Willkie as their presidential nominee, and Oregon Senator Charles A. L. McNary as their vice presidential nominee. Willkie campaigned against Roosevelt seeking a third term. Some Democrats even disapproved of a third term. He also claimed that a portion of the New Deal was a waste and that he would make it more efficient. But many Americans still blamed the Republican Party for the Great Depression. Willkie did campaign in areas where Roosevelt was very popular, making him a strong candidate. As Roosevelt was criticized for not having the nation prepared for war, but Roosevelt increased the size of the military, so that issue went away. Willkie said that Roosevelt would lead the United States into World War II. In response, Roosevelt stated that he would not send a single soldier into war under his presidency. In the end, Roosevelt won a third term. He won 54.74% of the popular vote and 84.56% of the electoral vote. This was a worse result than the last election. This election was also more polarizing due to the fact that involvement in a Second World War was looming. So what can we learn from this era? We can learn that with distress, people will give up their freedoms in hopes of protection. This is due to the expansion of the federal government during World War II and the expansion of government during World War I.